On many development sites, the first thing that gets built is not a road, a foundation, or a home. It is a number. A number in a land appraisal. A number attached to a future planning consent. A number based on homes that do not yet exist, sales that have not happened, costs that are still moving, and a program that may be little more than a row of dates in a spreadsheet. And once that number is agreed, the project starts carrying it. The architect has not drawn the scheme properly, the engineer has not tested the ground, the drainage, the structure of the infrastructure, the contractor has not priced the work, the planning authority has not necessarily settled the obligations, but the land has already been given a financial identity based on what everybody hopes will eventually be permitted. That is the part of planning we do not talk about enough. Planning is presented as a process for controlling development. And it is. It protects landscapes, heritage, public interests, infrastructure, and the character of places. That explanation is real. It is just not the whole explanation, is it? Because when permission is limited, uncertain and valuable, planning also creates scarcity. And scarcity does something very powerful to land. It turns permission into an asset. And once permission becomes an asset, the building starts serving the economics of the land long before it serves the people who may one day use it. People make projects that bring profits, but profits decide which projects get built and what people become. This is Bytnar Talks. People, projects, profits. Hi, I'm Piotr Bytnar, founder of Bytnar Limited, a chartered structural engineering practice established in 2017. Our work normally enters the story after a site has already acquired expectations. There is an assumed number of units, an assumed height, an assumed density, an assumed program. Sometimes an assumed construction cost that has been carried forward for longer than anyone really wants to admit. And then reality starts arriving. Ground conditions, drainage, access, fire strategy, structural depths, utilities, retaining walls, neighbors, existing buildings, buildability, procurement. The things that do not look particularly dramatic on a land appraisal, but become very real once somebody has to design and construct them. That is why this subject matters to Bytnar and to me. Not because we are planning consultants or land economists. We are not specifically, not in any meaningful way anyway. It matters because the pressure created in land and planning decisions eventually becomes physical. Somebody has to put it into concrete, steel, timber, drainage, labor, sequence and risk. And by the time that pressure reaches the project team, it is often described as a design problem or a construction problem. Well, sometimes it is. But often, the problem begins before the project team arrived. Let's think about a little story here. Think about two fields on the edge of the same British town, okay? Same soil, same weather, same distance from the station, same farmer complaining about the rain. One remains agricultural land, the other receives permission for housing. Nothing physical has happened yet, right? No road has been laid, no utility has been connected, no home has been built, but economically, they are no longer the same thing, are they? In October 2025, the House of Commons Housing Communities and Local Government Committee cited government policy appraisal estimates based on 2019 values, and they suggested that in England outside London, agricultural land granted residential planning permission could on average be valued about 2.67 million pounds per hectare, compared to about, guess what, £23,000 in agricultural use. This is a whopping over 116 times as much. The figures were hypothetical appraisal estimates rather than current market prices, but still quite important data. Now, that is not a valuation rule, is it? But the committee was careful to say that the range is extremely broad, and newer governmental estimates have since been published. Every site is different. Location, remediation, infrastructure, policy, tenure, and market conditions all matter, but the direction of travel is difficult to miss. The legal right to build can be worth far more than the physical land in its existing use. And that change in value does not wait for construction. It arrives when the probability of permission changes, sometimes through allocation, sometimes through an option agreement, sometimes through a promotion agreement, sometimes through a consent that makes the site tradable to a different kind of buyer. This is where people can become uncomfortable, because the word scarcity sounds as though somebody must be deliberately operating a machine. Usually nobody is. A planning officer is trying to apply policy, okay? A councillor is responding to local concerns. A landowner is deciding whether to sell or not. A developer is competing for a site. A funder is asking whether the risk is acceptable. A community is trying to protect the place it knows. All of those positions can be reasonable. The machine is what emerges when they interact. Planning restricts the places and forms in which development may happen. That is its job. But restriction makes the permitted opportunity scarce. And scarcity attracts competition. Competition pulls expected future value into the present land value. And the land price then becomes a financial weight carried by the scheme. No conspiracy is required here. The incentives are enough. And incentives direct the system where they direct it. This is why the most influential drawing on an early development is something not the drawing at all. It is the appraisal. At a very simplified level, the logic is familiar. Estimate the value of the completed development, deduct construction professional fees, finance, planning obligations, infrastructure, risk and the development return. What remains creates the amount the site can support. In theory, that remaining amount should discipline the land price. In practice, the land market does not always wait patiently for perfect information. There may be competing bidders, there may be hope value, there may be an owner who will not sell below a certain figure, there may be a strategic reason to control the site. There may be a planning assumption that looks reasonably today, but it is still untested. There may be a belief that density can be increased later, or that construction can be made cheaper, or that sales values will continue to rise. Yes, all of them pipe dreams, but they did happen for quite some time in the past, so, well, can't blame anyone for thinking the same way looking forward. So the number becomes an expectation, and once money has been committed, expectations become surprisingly difficult to move. You see this later in design meetings. The scheme is too expensive, so the grid tightens, the cores are reviewed, the transfer structure is questioned, the facade changes, the public realm reduces, the affordable housing mix is revisited, the drainage strategy is pushed into the less space, the contractor is asked whether there is another 5% somewhere. Everybody is working hard, but they are not necessarily optimizing the building. Are they? Sometimes they are recovering the land decision. That is a very different task, and it matters because technical optimization has limits. A structure can be efficient, but it still has to stand. A drainage system can be compact, but water still has to go somewhere. A program can be compressed, but the sequence still exists. A contractor can price risk aggressively, but the risk does not disappear. At Bytnar, that is where we tend to ask a fairly basic question early on. What has to be true for this site to work? Not just financially, technically and operationally. What has to be true about the ground, the access, the structure, utility, planning mix, build sequence, procurement route, local market? Because if 3 or 4 critical assumptions all need to be optimistic at the same time, the project is not robust. The project is a dream. It is merely balanced somehow. And balanced projects can look very convincing in a spreadsheet, right up until the assumptions begin meeting one another. This brings us to viability. The word sounds technical and neutral, and in one sense it perhaps is, but a scheme has revenues, costs, risks, obligations and returns. Someone has to test whether those parts can coexist. But viability is also where different versions of fairness meet. The local authority asks for affordable housing, roads, schools, drainage, biodiversity, public space and the infrastructure needed to make development acceptable. The developer asks whether the scheme can still be funded and delivered with a reasonable return for the risk being carried. The landowner asks whether there is enough value to justify selling. The community asks why the permission which created so much value is not producing more public benefit. And the design and delivery team sits in the middle, converting all of this into an actual place. Government guidance is quite clear about the intended order. Policy requirements should be visible and priced into land. The price somebody happened to pay for a site is not supposed to justify ignoring those policies. Benchmark land value is built from existing use value plus a reasonable premium, with policy costs, abnormal costs and infrastructure properly recognized. That is the clean version. Reality is less tidy. Policies change, markets change, interest rates move, build costs move, a utility connection that looked manageable becomes a major reinforcement, ground risk appears, a planning condition changes the sequence, sales values soften, affordable housing funding changes, the time needed to reach consent extends, and finance keeps running while nothing physical is being produced. So a viability meeting can become a room full of people defending different realities. The planner says the policy was known. The developer says the site no longer works. The quantity surveyor says the latest cost plan is evidence, not opinion. The engineer says the retaining wall is not optional. The architect says another round of compression will damage the scheme, and gradually the language becomes careful. Not because people are dishonest, because every person in the room is carrying a different responsibility, and each responsibility has a finance consequence. That is why viability should never be treated as just a spreadsheet review. It is an alignment test. Can the land expectation, the planning expectation, the technical reality, and the funding expectation all occupy the same project? That's a good question to have. When they connect, the pressure does not vanish, it travels. And this is where the subject changes. It stops being only a debate about how quickly planning departments process applications. It becomes a debate about who creates development value, who receives it, who carries the risk, and which part of the system is expected to absorb the difference when the assumptions do not hold. Planning permission is not merely an administrative yes or no. It is a public decision that changes private value. That does not make the value illegitimate. Landowners take risk. Promoters can spend years and significant money without certainty. Developers need returns to fund the next scheme. Investors need confidence. Communities need infrastructure. Local authorities need deliverable plans, not theoretical ones. But once we recognize that permission creates value, we also have to recognize what that value does to behavior. It rewards patience in land. It rewards the ability to navigate uncertainty. It rewards access to capital that can wait. It rewards organizations large enough to carry planning risk across a portfolio. And that can make the system especially difficult for smaller developers. The Competition and Market Authority found in 2024 that the planning system was creating significant downward pressure on permissions, with unpredictability, length, cost and complexity limiting house building and disproportionately affecting smaller builders. That is important, let it sit in, because scarcity does not only raise value, it changes who can participate. A large organization can hold options across many sites, tolerate failures, employ specialist planning teams and wait for the right moment. A small builder may have one site, one lender, one program, and far less room for uncertainty, especially with the bridging loans that are the breathing at your neck. The same planning system applies to both though. The capacity to survive, it does not. So when people say we need more competition in house building, that well may be true, but competition does not begin when the houses reach the market. It begins with access to land, permission, finance and time. By the time construction starts, a large part of the competitive structure may already have been decided. Construction is the easiest part of the system to see. You can see the labor, you can see the materials, you can see cranes, concrete wagons, the scaffold and the contractor invoice. You cannot see hope value in the same way. You cannot walk past a site and see the cost of a delayed consent, the finance on an option agreement, the value assumed in the future phase of the premium embedded in the land transaction. So when the numbers become difficult, attention moves towards the visible cost base. Why is the frame expensive? Can we reduce the foundations? Can the specification come down? Can the contractor sharpen the price? Can the consultant reduce fees? Can the program be shorter? Those are legitimate questions. Good projects should test cost and buildability. Engineers should challenge inefficient structures. Contractors should challenge sequence. Designers should not protect complexity merely because it is already drawn. But there is a difference between removing waste and asking the physical project to compensate for an upstream commercial assumption. The first improves the scheme, the second can hollow it out. You can usually tell which one is happening by the quality of the conversation. Real optimization is crucial. It asks what the project is trying to achieve, where the cost sits, what functions must be protected, and which alternatives genuinely improve value. Financial recovery is different. It arrives with a target already decided. Find 10%, remove 2 weeks, reduce the tonnage, keep the unit count. Do not move the planning submission. Do not touch the sales area. The answer is expected before the problem has been understood. And once that happens, the decision quality begins to compress. That is where Bytnar tends to look beyond the isolated technical question. The beam may be the item being discussed, but the beam is not necessarily the source of the pressure. Sometimes the useful question is not, can this member be made smaller? It is, why does the project need this saving now? And what else changes if we take it? The question is not resistance to value engineering. It is what makes value engineering real. There is another layer to this, because the future value capitalized into land is not always based on selling homes one by one. Sometimes the same apartment is viewed in two completely different ways. One person sees a home, a kitchen, a bedroom, a school route, a commute, a place to stay for years. Another sees a future income stream. Rent, operating cost, yield, vacancy, maintenance, capital growth, and a long-term asset in a portfolio. Neither view is imaginary. The building has to be both lived in and financed. Institutional investment can bring patient capital, professional management, and a reason to think about whole life performance rather than only the day of sale. It can support build to rent, affordable housing partnerships, and different routes to delivery. But it also changes the questions asked of the design. How reliable is the income? How standardized are the units? What is the operating cost? How quickly can phase be led? What does maintenance do to yield? How does the specification affect replacement cycles? The building becomes a physical wrapper around the financial model. Again, this is not automatically a criticism of the system. The problem comes when the financial identity becomes clearer than the human or technical identity. When everybody knows the target yield, but nobody has properly resolved overheating, maintenance, access, acoustic performance, drainage routes, or what the ground floor public realm will feel like on a wet Tuesday in February. Well, the imbalance matters because the building will outlive the appraisal that created it. A yield can be calculated, a badly coordinated structure is much harder to move. This also explains why saying developers should just build misses part of the business model. Development is often a sequence of risk transformations. Identify the land, control it through an option or agreement, promote it, secure allocation, obtain consent, resolve infrastructure, bring in finance, sell the site, partner it, phase it, or build it. Value can be created at several points in that chain. Construction is one of them. It is not always the first and it is not always the most profitable relative to the risk taken. That can look strange from a construction perspective because our instincts is physical. We think value should follow the act of making something. Land development does not always work that way. Value can follow the act of changing what may be made. The difference is subtle, but it explains a great deal. It explains why a consented site can be sold before a contractor is appointed, why planning expertise can be as commercially important as delivery expertise, why land promoters and house builders are not necessarily doing the same job, why the party that creates the permission value may not be the party that carries the construction risk. And it explains why project teams can sometimes feel that the scheme keeps changing hands while the physical reality remains unresolved. Each handover brings a new model, a new return requirement, a new funding condition, or a new interpretation of the consent. The drawings may look similar, the project is not the same. This is where retained technical memory matters. Somebody has to remember why the levels were set, why the drainage route moved, why the retaining strategy changed, why a particular structural grid was selected and which assumptions are still open. Without that memory, the site keeps being financially reinterpreted while the technical risk accumulates quietly in the background. Then we reach the question that frustrates almost everybody outside development. If a site has planning permission, why are the homes not built immediately? There are bad explanations for slow delivery. There can be delay, weak coordination, funding problems, infrastructure problems, strategic behavior, and poor project control. But there is also a commercial explanation that is less dramatic and more powerful. The local market can absorb only so many similar homes at a given price within a given period. The Letwin review looked at large sites and concluded that the homogeneity of homes and tenures, together with limits on how quickly the market would absorb them, was a fundamental driver of slow build-up. On the sample it studied, the median build-out period was 15.5 years. That does not mean every large site takes that long, or that the finding explains every delay. But it exposes the logic. If a scheme releases too many near-identical homes into one local market too quickly, the sales rate can fall or prices can soften. If the land and funding model was built around expected values, a sharp fall in price can damage the entire scheme. So phases are managed, sales are monitored, infrastructure is sequenced, new parcels open as earlier ones progress. The pace of construction responds not only to what the contractor can build, but to what the market can take at the required value. And now the feedback loop becomes visible. Planning scarcity makes consented land valuable. High land value requires the development to protect its financial assumptions. Those assumptions depend on achievable sales or rental values. Protecting those values limits how quickly similar product can be released. Slow build-out then reinforces the public sense of scarcity. Well, here we come to the discussion on the machine that starts feeding itself. This is why simply granting more units on one very large site may not deliver them at the rate the headline suggests. The answer may be involve more permissions, but also more sites, more builders, more tenure diversity, more product diversity. Better infrastructure and delivery models that are not all dependent on the same sales market. Planning controls quantity and form. Delivery also depends on the structure of demand. So we arrive at the uncomfortable question: what is the planning system protecting? The charitable answer is straightforward. It protects people from uncontrolled development. It protects countryside, heritage, ecological value, infrastructure capacity, neighborhoods, design quality, and the long-term shape of places. So romantic. The National Planning Policy Framework describes planning as a balance of economic, social, and guess what? Environmental objectives. Don't get me wrong, that balance matters, right? I am a little bit facetious here, but a country without planning would not be a free market paradise. It would be a coordination failure made physical. Roads without capacity, homes without schools, development in flood risk, places that externalize cost onto everybody around them, heritage lost because the individual transaction could not account for the collective value. Planning is necessary, okay? But necessary systems still create side effects. When permission is scarce, the owners of already developed property benefit from limited competing supply. Land with consent captures uplift. Land without consent carries hope. Communities trying to resist change can unintentionally protect the value of existing scarcity. Political caution can become economic rent without anybody voting for economic rent directly. So the honest answer is that planning can protect several things at once. It protects legitimate public value, and it can also protect incumbent value. Those two are not always easy to separate. A green field can be landscape habitat, food production amenity, and a speculative asset at the same time. A historic town can be a community people love and a place where exclusion from new supply increases the value of what already exists. A planning refusal can prevent bad development and preserve scarcity in the same decision. This is why shouting at one side rarely helps. Developers are not automatically villains for responding to land economics. Planners are not automatically blockers for applying public policy. Communities are not irrational for caring about change. Contractors are not inefficient merely because the project is struggling to carry its earlier assumptions. The useful question is not who is the bad actor. It is what does the structure reward and what consequence does that reward create later. What gets rewarded gets repeated, right? Now, none of this gives a project team the power to redesign the national planning system from a Tuesday morning design meeting, okay? But it does change how a site should be approached. It means the land decision cannot sit in a separate commercial universe from technical reality. Before the price hardens, somebody needs to test the assumption that can destroy it later. Not every detail, that would be impossible. Well, maybe not for too long. AI is coming big time. But the big things, what density is actually supported by access structure, fire strategy, daylight, drainage, and public realm. What ground and infrastructure risks could change the cost base? Which planning obligations are known, which are emerging, and which have not been allowed for? Does the program recognize the real sequence of consent, discharge, utilities, and procurement? Is the proposed product genuinely absorbable, or does the appraisal assume a sale pace the local market has never demonstrated? And perhaps most importantly, what happens if one assumption moves? A robust scheme does not require every variable to behave perfectly. It has room to learn. This is very much the kind of thinking I try to bring at Bytnar. Not a promise that every risk can be removed, because it cannot. Let's be realistic here. Not the claim that engineering decides the development model, because it does not. The role is to make the physical consequences of commercial assumptions visible early enough to matter. If a unit target creates structural transfer, say it early. If a basement assumption carries abnormal ground and waterproofing risk, say it early. If the drainage strategy depends on land outside the red line, say it early. If the program assumes utilities will behave like a subcontract package, challenge it early, because late clarity is expensive clarity. By then people are no longer deciding freely, they are protecting positions. That is when meetings get shorter, language gets safer, the cost plan becomes a negotiation rather than information, design decisions are made to preserve a date, and the team starts administering pressure instead of learning from the project. Earlier visibility does not make the scheme easy. It makes the difficulty honest. There is a line I keep coming back to with this subject. The building is often asked to justify the land price. Think about what that means. The land was valued because of a future building. Then the future building is designed to recover the value already attributed to the land. The expectation creates the price. The price then disciplines the outcome. That circularity is where planning, finance, and construction become inseparable. It is also why project can become less flexible precisely when it needs more learning. The site is acquired, right? The consent strategy is public. The funder has approved a model. The sales team has a product position. The program is reported. Each commitment narrows the space in which the technical team can respond. And then we act surprised when people become defensive about change. They're not defending a drawing. They're defending the chain of commitments attached to it. This is why project leadership needs the maturity to separate sunk expectation from current evidence. Sometimes the responsible decision is to change the scheme. Sometimes it is to change the land value expectation. Sometimes it is to change the tenure or phasing. Sometimes it is to stop trying to make one project carry every public and private objective simultaneously. None of those decisions are comfortable, okay? But discomfort is not the same as failure. Failure is allowing the project to continue carrying a number that reality has already disproved. Planning is one of the ways society decides what may become physical. That decision has to weigh homes, infrastructure, environment, heritage, local voice, national need, and private capital. There is no version of that which is simple. But we should be honest about the economics created by the decision. Permission is not neutral. It creates value. It concentrates value. It changes behavior. And the value created at the planning stage does not remain in planning. It moves into the land price, then into the appraisal, then into density, specification, obligation, procurement, and program. Eventually, it arrives on site. Usually, disguised as a request to make something cheaper, faster, or smaller. That is why the visible construction problem can be true and still incomplete. The contractor may be expensive, the design may need work, the program may be slow, the planning authority may be under-resourced, the developer may be cautious. All of that can be true, but the deeper question is what the project was required to carry before any of those problems became visible. A site does not become viable because everybody agrees to call it viable. It becomes viable when land policy, design, delivery, finance and demand can survive contact with one another. And perhaps that is the real scarcity in the system. Not land, not even the permission, but the space to make an honest decision before the number becomes too important to question. So this is it, folks. Just a different way of looking at the field, the spreadsheet and the building that eventually has to stand on it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Design the world around you.